Beneath the roar of Rome, beneath the marble certainty of its temples and the iron confidence of its legions, there existed another city, unseen, unheard, and yet profoundly alive. While chariots rattled along the Appian Way and emperors received incense as gods, a quieter procession slipped down into the earth itself. Stone steps descended into darkness. Oil lamps trembled. Breath slowed. Here, under layers of soil and empire, faith learned to whisper. The catacombs were not born from rebellion, but from necessity, not carved as monuments, but hollowed as refuge. Rome ruled the surface, but beneath it, another kingdom was learning how to breathe. The tunnels wound like veins beneath the city's heart, stretching mile after mile, cut patiently by hands that knew both fear and hope. The air was damp, heavy with dust and memory, and the walls carried names scratched in haste and love. Some belonged to children, some to martyrs, some to bishops whose voices would never echo again in daylight. Yet here, in the earth's embrace, the living gathered beside the dead, and the dead were not silent. Their resting places became pulpits, their bones, witnesses. Rome believed power was vertical, descending from gods to emperors to subjects. But the church learned power could move downward, into humility, into hiddenness, into the ground itself. As the empire expanded outward, the faith descended inward, retreating not in defeat, but in preparation. These underground chambers were not places of despair. They were wombs. The darkness did not extinguish belief, it refined it. Every footstep echoed with risk, every gathering balanced between worship and arrest. Still they came. Here, beneath statues of false divinity above, prayers rose from below. Bread was broken quietly. Words were spoken softly yet with unshakable conviction. This was not an escape from the world, but a confrontation with its deepest truths. The empire above demanded loyalty unto death. The church below offered life through death. And so, in the silence beneath Rome, the future of Christianity took shape, not in marble or gold, but in dust, darkness, and defiant hope, waiting patiently for dawn that seemed impossibly far away. The descent into the catacombs was never casual. Each gathering began with listening, ears trained for footsteps, for the scrape of armor, for the echo of danger following close behind. Rome tolerated many gods, but it could not tolerate a faith that refused to bow to Caesar's image. To worship beneath the empire was to confess that ultimate authority did not reside in palaces or thrones. And so the faithful learned the cost of belief, counting it carefully as they counted each step downward into the earth. The catacombs themselves grew slowly, carved not by architects but by devotion. Families expanded tunnels beside the graves of loved ones, stacking niches like shelves of memory. Walls filled with symbols rather than statues, the fish, the anchor, the shepherd carrying a lamb. These images spoke in code, teaching without shouting, proclaiming hope without attracting notice. Scripture lived here not in scrolls alone, but in gesture and symbol, in shared glances and remembered words. When the Psalms were whispered, they sounded different underground, heavier, closer to the bones. Above ground, persecution waxed and waned with the temper of emperors. Below ground, vigilance never rested. The church understood that survival required discipline. Bishops guided communities through darkness, reminding them that Christ himself had been laid in a tomb. The earth that concealed them also connected them to him. The grave was no longer merely an end, it was a passage. In these tunnels, death lost some of its terror, for it had been named and faced daily. Yet fear remained. Parents held children tightly, knowing discovery could mean imprisonment or worse. Converts hesitated before baptism, aware that faith might shorten their lives. The catacombs absorbed these fears like stone absorbs water, holding them without judgment. Faith here was not triumphant, but tenacious. It did not shout victory, it practiced endurance. The deeper the church moved underground, the more Rome's presence pressed in above. Rumors spread of informers, of hidden entrances revealed, of prayers interrupted by chains. Every gathering could be the last. Still they returned, drawn by something stronger than fear. In the growing tension between empire and faith, the catacombs became the narrow place where conviction was tested, where belief learned to endure without applause, sustained only by the promise that darkness was not the final word. As persecutions intensified, the catacombs transformed from refuge into crucible. What began as burial grounds became sanctuaries, and sanctuaries became places of decision. The faithful no longer gathered merely to remember the dead, but to prepare themselves to join them. Each Eucharist carried a sharper edge, every prayer an unspoken farewell. The tunnels filled not only with bodies, but with courage slowly forged under pressure. Roman authority sensed the threat, though it struggled to name it. How could a movement so hidden, so materially powerless, persist? Soldiers marched above, unaware that beneath their feet men and women prayed for their souls. Emperors issued edicts, but the earth swallowed their proclamations in silence. The catacombs did not resist with swords, they resisted with memory. Names were preserved when faces were erased. Martyrs were remembered when their executioners were forgotten. In these narrow corridors, hierarchy and humility coexisted. Bishops celebrated the sacred mysteries beside laborers and slaves. The church's structure remained intact, even strengthened, precisely because it was forced inward. Authority was no longer adorned. It was earned through suffering. The faithful watched their leaders risk everything to remain present, to baptize, to absolve, to bury with dignity those Rome discarded. The imagery carved into the walls grew bolder. Jonah emerging from the whale, Daniel standing unharmed among lions. These were not decorations. They were declarations of trust. They reminded the living that deliverance often followed descent, that God worked not only in triumph, but in confinement. The catacombs became a living catechism etched in stone, teaching through silence what sermons could not proclaim aloud. With each arrest above ground, the community below grew more resolute. They did not seek martyrdom, but they no longer feared it as final defeat. Death had become familiar, almost domestic, woven into the rhythm of worship. Children learned the names of martyrs as easily as those of relatives. Faith matured quickly here, stripped of illusion, sustained by hope that reached beyond the tunnels. The escalation was not explosive, but relentless. Pressure increased. Space tightened. Fear sharpened. Yet in this constriction, belief found clarity. The catacombs were no longer merely beneath the empire. They stood in quiet judgment over it, revealing a strength Rome could not comprehend, a faith that grew stronger the deeper it was pressed into the earth. The true conflict of the catacombs was not fought between Christians and Rome alone, but within the human heart itself. Each descent forced a reckoning: safety or faith, silence or witness, survival or surrender. The tunnels echoed with these unspoken struggles, absorbing tears shed in the dark. Some faltered, some fled, some returned marked by regret. The church held them all, wounded and faithful alike, teaching mercy even as danger circled close. Above ground, Rome offered clarity: obey, conform, live. Below ground, faith offered mystery: trust, endure, hope. The empire demanded visible allegiance. The church cultivated invisible fidelity. This tension deepened as persecution sharpened, revealing how fragile imperial power truly was. Rome could command bodies, but it could not command conscience. The catacombs protected that interior freedom, allowing belief to grow roots beyond the reach of law or sword. Here, time behaved differently. The dead were not distant. Their presence pressed close, reminding the living that their choices carried eternal weight. Graves lined the walls like witnesses, their inscriptions speaking of peace, of rest, of victory won through suffering. These were not tales of conquest, but of perseverance. The faithful learned to see themselves as part of an unbroken line, stretching backward to the apostles and forward into an unseen future. The conflict also sharpened the church's understanding of itself. Cut off from public life, it discovered its true center. Worship was stripped to essentials: word, sacrament, community. Without buildings to claim, the faithful themselves became the living temple. The catacombs reinforced this truth daily, as stone ceilings pressed low above heads lifted in prayer. Fear remained, but it no longer ruled. The darkness became familiar, even protective. The empire's glare above seemed harsher by contrast, exposing its emptiness. The faithful began to understand that Rome's power depended on spectacle, while the church's power grew in concealment. This realization did not erase danger, but it transformed it. In the deepening conflict, the catacombs ceased to feel like hiding places. They became thresholds, spaces where believers crossed from fear into resolve. Each gathering affirmed that faith did not belong to daylight alone. It could survive night, stone, and silence. And in learning to live beneath the empire, the church was quietly preparing to outlast it. There came moments when the catacombs trembled, not from earthquakes, but from footsteps above that stopped too suddenly. A shouted order, a clash of metal. In those moments, breath held, and the faithful stood poised between escape and surrender. Some were caught, some were dragged into the light, and when they did not renounce their faith, the tunnels gained new inhabitants whose witness burned brighter than any lamp. The climax of this hidden struggle was not a single event, but a pattern repeated across generations. Martyrs emerged from the catacombs to face execution with a calm that unsettled their judges. They had already confronted death daily, praying beside it, touching it, honoring it without worshiping it. The arena could not terrify those who had learned hope underground. Rome intended public death to shame and deter. Instead, it revealed the weakness of spectacle against conviction. The faithful returned to the catacombs carrying stories of courage that deepened resolve. Names were added to walls. Graves filled. The church did not shrink. It thickened, layered with testimony. The blood of martyrs seeped metaphorically into the stone, sanctifying even the darkness. In these moments, the empire's logic fractured. Power failed to silence belief. Fear failed to extinguish love. The catacombs bore silent witness to this reversal. What Rome despised as weakness proved unbreakable. The faithful understood now that their hidden worship was not merely survival. It was participation in a larger mystery, one in which suffering was not meaningless but transformative. The climax reached its quiet peak when persecution could no longer contain what it sought to destroy. The church's strength had been forged underground, immune to intimidation. When emperors eventually ceased their attacks, they found a faith no longer fragile, no longer easily erased. The catacombs had done their work. The tunnels remained, etched with prayers and names, holding the memory of a victory Rome never recognized. Not a victory of force, but of fidelity. In the darkest places beneath the empire, the church had learned how to stand, and in doing so, had already overcome. When the persecutions finally eased, the faithful emerged cautiously, blinking in the light, carrying with them the discipline of darkness. The catacombs did not empty. They remained sacred, honored as places where faith had been preserved at its most vulnerable. Above ground, churches rose, open and visible, yet they carried within them the memory of stone ceilings and whispered prayers. The underground had shaped everything that followed. Rome itself began to change. The empire that once hunted believers now tolerated, then accepted, then elevated the faith it could not destroy. Yet the church never forgot where it had learned endurance. The catacombs remained a silent measure against triumphalism, reminding believers that strength was born not from favor, but from faithfulness under pressure. Pilgrims returned to these tunnels, not to hide, but to remember. They traced names with reverent fingers, prayed beside graves, and listened to the echo of ancient courage. The catacombs taught that the church's true foundation was not imperial approval, but sacrificial love. Even as Christianity emerged into daylight, it carried the catacombs within its soul. The humility learned underground tempered authority above ground. The memory of persecution guarded against complacency. The faith that had survived concealment now faced a different danger, forgetting the cost of its survival. Yet the stones endured. The tunnels held fast, preserving testimony long after emperors faded into history. They whispered of nights when worship meant risk, when belief demanded everything. The church learned to honor that past not as relic, but as living inheritance. Resolution did not erase suffering. It gave it meaning. The catacombs were no longer refuges, but they remained witnesses, reminding every generation that faith is strongest when it clings to hope without guarantees. The empire passed. The tunnels remained. And in their silence, they continued to speak. The catacombs invite us to remember that faith does not depend on comfort, visibility, or approval. It is born where hope chooses to remain despite fear. Beneath Rome's empire, Believers discovered that worship could survive without walls, without safety, without recognition. What sustained them was not defiance, but trust. Trust that light would follow darkness, that resurrection followed burial. Their story challenges every age tempted to equate strength with power and truth with dominance. The Catacombs reveal another measure: fidelity in hidden places, courage without applause, love stronger than fear. They ask us where we kneel when no one sees, what we hold when all else is stripped away. In the silence beneath the empire, faith learned to endure. And in remembering it, we are reminded that even now, in our own shadows, God remains present, shaping hearts quietly, patiently, beneath the surface of history. Lord of light and shadow, teach us the faith of those who worshipped in darkness. Grant us courage to trust you when the world grows heavy, and humility to remember that true strength is born in love. Amen.